Good afternoon and welcome to INCITE in Conversation. My name is Andrew Finnegan and I am the editor of INCITE magazine. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, whom I acknowledge as the traditional owners of this land. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge Kirsten Thorpe and any other Indigenous people present at today's session. This week is NAIDOC week and its theme of Heal Country is a call to action that is quite relevant to today's discussion as we reflect on the work that libraries and information services still need to do to embrace First Nations cultural knowledge and their understanding of country. So, the usual Zoom housekeeping first. Please keep your computers set to mute and your cameras off. Also, please do use the group chat function if you want to make any comments or ask any questions. We will have time to answer questions towards the end of this session. So today I am joined by Kirsten Thorpe and Kathryn Greenhill, who have each written articles in the ALIA INCITE Digital Supplement, which focuses on workforce diversity. Kirsten Thorpe is a senior researcher at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. She has led the development of protocols, policies, and services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in libraries and archives in Australia. She is a PhD candidate at Monash University, where she is investigating Indigenous cultural safety and self-determination in Australian libraries and archives. Kathryn Greenhill has collaborated in libraries for over 30 years and has been a university lecturer in libraries, records, and archives for over a decade. She has presented, keynoted, and given workshops nationally and internationally on libraries, technology, and community connection. She moved to Adelaide just this year in 2021 to join the Information Management and STEM team at the University of South Australia. So please make them both very welcome. So I wanted to start off with Kirsten. So Kirsten, could you please tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing and the considerations around cultural safety when it comes to the way we educate and build the library workforce?
Thanks, Andrew. And firstly, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm calling in from the lands of the Darkinjung people at the Central Coast, and I want to acknowledge elders past and present, and particularly acknowledge this week's NAIDOC theme, Healing Country, and extend an acknowledgement to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the call today. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm a senior researcher at Jumbunna Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and also a doctoral student at Monash University, where I'm looking at, the questions of Indigenous cultural safety in libraries and archives. And really those questions for me are looking at to what extent do our current practices and systems in libraries and archives broadly support an ongoing colonial project. And in that context, do our current systems actually assault Indigenous people and our cultures? Or do the current approaches support dialogue and listening and respect for Indigenous people's self-determination? And I guess the other work that I've been doing in the context of being here today, I've written in the INCITE article about a piece of research that I've been doing on Indigenous employment nationally in Australian libraries that will be released later this month. And the research really highlights the gaps in the current workforce around Indigenous priorities. And I guess to start the conversation, also want to acknowledge the participants to that research and the expert working group that work with me. But I guess sort of overall, I see my role as a researcher as trying to bring some greater understanding to some of the critical issues that are happening in the sector. And I'm really interested in the conversation of partnership research to support surfacing of new evidence that we need to bring change in the sector. And I just want to point out the picture in the background, also acknowledging in terms of my identity is Warramai land at Port Stephens. So also acknowledging my connections to that area today.
Oh, thanks, Kirsten. Moving on to Kathryn. Kathryn, you've written a bit about the work that you've been doing in developing the LIS coursework at the University of South Australia. Can you tell us a bit more about that work and how you went about getting Kirsten involved?
Okay, I acknowledge that I'm coming from Greenhill land, and elders past and present, and anybody who's Indigenous on the call. What I've done is I've come here, and in the last blur of several months, one of the things I've done is updated the foundational unit for information management students here, postgrad archives, records, and librarianship. It's the jigsaw box unit. So basically the course is going to be handing them different pieces of the jigsaw. The idea of this unit is they do it first and they actually know where it's going to be placed. So it's based on ALIA's competencies and ethics everywhere. But when I looked at it, there was a lot I wanted to add. There was a lot I wanted to be there. And one of my main thoughts was, it's nice that I've got a platform, but one of the things I want to do is my voice is not the voice that needs to tell all the stories here. And it's really important that students hear and understand the stories. And one of the things I can do is actually curate. So it's quite different to the way that lecturers usually do things. So there's 3 things that I looked at. One was basically Indigenous content, Indigenous voices. One of the things I did is I invited Kirsten and Kim Terry from New Zealand to talk about whatever they wanted to, that they thought was important around for foundational students to know. To me, it was really important that I didn't say, I want you to talk about this, you're going to be special topic of the week, and then we're going to forget. It was really important. So I said, look, this is where it's slotting in. But basically, I invited them to challenge students and myself with whatever they wanted to say. I wanted to make sure that there was space for missing voices and for students to actually have a look more than certainly when I went through about whose voice was missing, because we know the stats. In fact, I tell the students the stats. I look at the ALIA diversity report at the start in the first week saying, look, this is what we've got. And kind of asking, does that reflect our clients? Does that reflect the student body? I don't think it does. And I think there's gaps there, and I think they need to be noticed. So I invite them to notice who's not there. I also try to get materials from Nothing About Us Without Us is sort of where I come from, is, you know, if somebody's talking about living with disability, let's get the voice in of people who are doing that, not actually have me say, this is what you should do for these people. And also for people to understand there's subtleties, people will say different things. You know, it's not just there's one monolith. So providing opportunities to listen. 1 week is just saying, here's some voices of people talking about what it's like to be LGBTQI, transgender, and how that interacts with our practice. So I always get students to come out asking more questions, but this study period, I've changed the focus a bit. So some of the questions I want them to be asking is, who's being damaged by what we do? How can we fix this damage? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And how can we actually contribute positively? So in the middle of the course, we're sort of talking about access and inclusivity, and sort of that's kind of, well, let's make sure that we're actually following legislation. But by the end of the course, I want them actually looking at things like emotional informed practice, looking at trauma in the archives and what it means to have people coming in who have been hurt, and what type of personal strengths and considerations they're going to have to actually support that. The third thing I'm looking at is student diversity. Often there's 2 things that happen in university courses. One is tutors and students presume everybody is there to get the top mark. And it's almost punitive if they do an assessment where they haven't actually done stuff. And it's actually, students get very, oh, I've not done this right. This is upsetting. This is my personal core that's being attacked here. And it may well just be that they had kids, they had a job, they had other things to do. And what I try to do is normalize the fact that actually sometimes you're doing what you can. So I asked them at the start, what do you want to get out of it? and some of them want to just pass. And it's actually allowing for the fact that they might be coping with health issues. They might be coping with discrimination that makes it really hard for them to actually stomach some of the stuff that they're reading, in which case I want to acknowledge that they are bringing what they bring into the course as well. I also, just as sort of a final point, is let them know that I have one set of experiences and knowledge, and I have a lot of really smart, well-experienced students. And if we can, I try to create a platform where they can actually bring that strength to the course. So that's it in a nutshell.
In a very big nutshell, that is. So, Kirsten, with your experience as a guest lecturer in Kathryn's course, I'm interested to know what the primary topics and issues were that you felt that foundational students needed to know, and if these are things that are perhaps sufficiently or at all embedded in the coursework at present.
Yeah, so it's always interesting when you kind of take on that role as a guest lecturer and you don't have existing relationships with the group, or in this case, Kathryn reaching out and saying, come and talk. It's always, I guess part of it is trying to gauge where people, where their learning is up to in the moment, sort of taking the opportunities to talk about some of the issues that people may not have come across. So, for me, in engaging with those spaces, I always like to go to, the questions of why, like, what's the broader context of this work? And, I think that people are starting to realize more and more, although it's been a couple of, 3-decade-old conversation, that libraries and archives haven't been, friendly spaces for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's never to negate the, really significant and important work that's happening. It's so important that we acknowledge and give visibility to that. But, in going and engaging in these conversations with students, I think it's really important. And for me as a researcher and, trying to be an advocate in the sector, is to talk about the fact that many of these programs are ad hoc and they're dependent on, people's leadership, and that can change. And we can go leaps and bounds when we have people who are really effective in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander priorities. But if that leadership changes, then we can actually slip back. So kind of giving people that broader context of, how do we fit into things like the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people? But, the work of libraries and archives is so critical for that. But I guess just responding to some of the comments that Kathryn has made as well, that we also can't engage in these conversations with just the friendly stuff. And I think that, for me, some of the conversations about the hard truths that we need to face as a sector of, how have libraries and archives contributed to the dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? How do libraries and archives continue to work in a paradigm that does not recognise Indigenous people's sovereignties? They're things that we can't shy away from. So it's been difficult for me in the kind of cultural safety paradigm to have that conversation about, how we respond to the hurt and how we respond to the trauma, but not doing that in a way that takes away the truth telling that needs to happen. So I think, talking to students about some of those really complex and, they are challenging topics, because essentially what you're trying to do is to get people to reflect on themselves and to reflect on their position in terms of their work. So, they're the things that I want, I really encourage people to think about. What are the kind of skills that we need to really start to radically change the way that we operate in the sector? And some of that is actually thinking about, challenging your assumptions. One of the things I talk about a lot is, how our current paradigms are all about extracting material from communities rather than actually nurturing, and sustaining local practices. So, they're really challenging things for people to come into the sector and start to think, do they have a role in either perpetuating that or supporting a change? So I think in leading up to this conversation, I said to Kathryn, what was the feedback from the students? It's sometimes really overwhelming if you haven't been in a dialogue around Indigenous priorities and Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, then it is, yeah, it's material that I think you need to go away and consider more deeply. So I would think that even in the context of a guest lecture, it's very much the start of the conversation. And it's good to extend that in other kind of learning opportunities afterwards.
Did you have any, I guess, concerns about the tone and how comfortable or uncomfortable you wanted students to feel? I mean, I would assume, and Kathryn can comment on this, that part of that critical process is to be able to engage with that discomfort and be open to being uncomfortable so that you can challenge those ideas and be reflective.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because in any learning context, you want people to feel connected and to feel safe in that endeavor. But unfortunately, if you're looking at a history of colonialism, a lot of the history is uncomfortable. And I think that even in my doctoral research, one of the major themes that is coming out is the importance of people having skills to be uncomfortable. So we need to actually sit with that, and we need to not take it personally. But we actually have to think about some of the systemic issues that are present, and we can't deal with them unless we actually start to be both reflective and consider our roles in that kind of work. So, I mean, I think it's kind of that thing of, for me in the work that I do, of how do we support that kind of cultural competency space, people developing their skills while also making sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's priorities are supported. And there's a lot of conflict there, and I think recognizing that is a part of it. But we also have a really amazing history in Australia of having things like the ATSI protocols, very much in need of review, but we actually have some really incredible tools and frameworks that people can engage with to work through some of this complexity. So I feel like that balance of, the hopefulness is there of the change that's needed, but we actually do need to do some pretty serious truth telling as well.
I think that one of the things that when Kirsten sort of asked what was the feedback thing, sort of I said, well, in some ways there was positive feedback in that, they mentioned Kim and Kirsten by name in the feedback for the course, but in some of it, it was sowing seeds. It was, I think people very much thought a lot, but it's a 10-week course, and this was week 5, I think, that Kirsten lectured, and they had a lot of stuff to do. So I think that actually I'm hoping the value is going to be sort of rippling out, and that's one of the things, actually giving opportunity. And a lot of the time what I think we need to do is to give invitation. So look, you've seen it here, then you're going to see it in another course, you're going to see it in another course. Maybe you didn't do that reading, don't feel bad, but it's there, it's open, you know where to look, and I think that's really important. I also was really struck when we were talking before about, I've sort of just been poking around and sort of accidentally, because it felt right, finished this particular course on care, self-care, bringing your whole self to work, emotions. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. But Kirsten really made it clear to me that self-reflection, that ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, but also be very human and make mistakes and actually grieve and actually feel hurt by what we do and really be confused and puzzled and not know, is part of professionalism, rather than having that glossy, everything's okay, we're going to go be fine, I'm well dressed. And, actually professionalism can sometimes mean that vulnerability, that ability to question in order to make all the mistakes we're going to make. So I think that one of the things that sort of just from talking to Kirsten about this type of thing that I'm going to take away is just that approach around reflection and self-knowledge is a really powerful thing to make systematic change. And I think that's a really interesting sort of little tension there.
Thanks, Kathryn. So back to Kirsten, I'm talking a bit about cultural safety. what are some of the factors around cultural safety that we all need to be aware of in terms of the burden of the cultural labour that is placed upon Indigenous workers? Was there, I guess, data or feedback that came through your research around, I guess, the damage that's currently causing and the ways that we can, I guess, mitigate that damage and share the burden, as it were?
Yeah, I guess kind of looking at both my doctoral studies and also the piece of work for that I've been doing on Indigenous employment, we've got some really critical gaps in terms of representation. So, you know, what that means essentially is that the people that are working in this sector, you know, potentially are working to contributing to things like strategy. They're being called upon to do, you know, multiple roles that are often sort of rendered invisible. So that's one piece of work that I guess we need to come to grips with, that we need to increase the workforce, but we also need to consider the, you know, the particular type of roles, and we need to make visible the work that people are doing. So you can't get someone in, you know, to do story time and then be asking them to, you know, also advise on, you know, consultation or engagement, or engage them in conversations about copyright. And that is typically the scenario that Indigenous people in the sector are often pushed and pulled in different directions. And I think one of the really critical things around cultural safety is that we need to consider that many libraries are also part of wider bureaucracies, and the research that speaks to the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the public sector can raise, you know, really entrenched issues of institutional racism, stereotypes, and that wider cultural load that, you know, really the data is only starting to be much more visible about that work. So I think there's some, you know, issues there that we need to look at. But I guess on the other side, you know, we've got the challenge that often Indigenous identified positions are a great sort of bridging gap to address employment issues, but some people don't want to take their identity to work. You know, they want to be there to do their particular role, and they don't necessarily want to work in an Indigenous, you know, type of engagement, or, you know, building Indigenous priorities. So I think some of them nuances are really important for organizations and institutions to consider in terms of having people's informed consent about how they're represented. But I think, you know, one of the things that I reflect on so deeply in terms of, you know, I've had really incredible participants to, you know, my doctoral studies. And I think one of the things we often get really busy in the work that needs to happen, and we actually need to realize that there's a lot of work that is kind of happening simultaneously around healing, around redress. You know, if we look at areas like revitalization of Indigenous languages, it's such significant work, but there's also a whole other side where people are regrouping as a community. They're looking at, you know, how do we do this in a way that supports community in a nourishing way. So I think that to me is some of the work in terms of cultural safety, that, you know, we have to be thinking about the multiple things that are happening and the relationships that are really critical to do that. So, you know, one other sort of, you know, reflection to share is that, you know, my doctoral research has shown so much the commitment and the drive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers in this sector, and the huge amount of leadership that is shown by people in their roles. And, you know, I'm really hoping that, you know, when I finish and start to disseminate that research, that we can really shine a light on just the deeply ingrained commitment that's coming from, you know, Indigenous workers in the sector. But I think that we still have a really long way to go in terms of this work. And again, that truth-telling element comes back and weaves through all the time.
Thanks, Kirsten. Kathryn, just following on from those themes around safety, when encouraging students to share their own identity and experiences, how do you, as an educator, provide safety in what can be an exercise in exposing one's vulnerabilities?
Yeah, nobody ever has to expose anything that they don't want to at all. But one of the things I do is in my first assessment with students, and I do it no matter what my assessment is, what course I'm doing, is I invite students to tell me something about themselves that they want to. As an educator, it's one-to-one, so it's not anything that's shared with the rest of the class, but just if there is different stuff that they want to let me know, it's actually really maybe useful. I do a lot of around encouraging people to normalizing stuff like depression, anxiety, and cognitive difference, where people have trouble understanding instructions, for example. I do it in public on online boards rather than one-to-one in email, partly because it's a time I just can't do it one-to-one, but partly because if you normalize asking questions, actually people do see that other people think like them, and they are more likely not only to ask questions, but to contribute their viewpoint. But it's always offering and it's always giving space. But one of the things I do is I don't actually lecture. I do a weekly Zoom session where it's, you know, I liken it to Whovians on Doctor Who rather on ABC rather than Doctor Who. So we talk about the material, but they can ask what works for them. So instead of me telling them 5 things that they really already knew and missing out that one important thing that they really needed to know about, if they've had a look at the material, we can then spend it sort of going where they want. And I've had a lovely class recently where they wanted to know about Zotero. It wasn't on the course, but they actually said, this is what we want to know. Can we do that? So actually allowing space in the curriculum, and the same with Kirsten, you know, if she says stuff that's totally opposite to what I've been teaching on the curriculum or what I want students to know, I'm going to have to just suck it up and work out how to do it, and the course is going to be richer for it, but not insisting that she's going to come in and, you know, say some stuff that's going to challenge people, but allowing space and a bit of flexibility, I think.
Now we've got time for a couple of questions before we finish. We've got one question, or it's actually a couple of questions from Arjun. When we speak about engendering diversity within LS education, what challenges have you encountered when it comes to laying heads together and giving voice to the unvoiced?
Yeah, really important question. And, you know, I think in terms of Indigenous people, you know, in Australia, is just thinking about the diversity of the people that, you know, in the broader community, the diversity of voices that need to come into the mix, I guess, is one of the first things, you know, that I think about in terms of the unvoiced. That, you know, I might be here today talking about the things that I know, but there's also, you know, across Australia, people have different needs, and different communities represent things in different ways. So, I mean, the thing that I sort of think about the most, and, you know, the importance of the work that I've been doing at the moment, is looking at Indigenous research methodologies and how they intersect with library and information science. And I think that that's a really important area of growth. Things like the IACCESS research code are really integral in terms of looking at, you know, things like reciprocity and trust and mutual benefit. You know, they're all core to, I think, the work that we need to do in our sector. And I'm really looking forward to contributing to some of that in the future.
Just with the idea of the unvoiced, I think one of the really interesting things that I'm not sure how we deal with it, but is hidden diversity. You know, there's each of us on this call, we probably represent all sorts of different groups that we're not necessarily identifying with, we're not necessarily publicly mentioning. So I think it's really, 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 really important to somehow include within our conversations that just because that person opposite you is presenting in a particular way, you don't know how hard it is for them to present that way or not. You don't know their background. You can't make presumptions at all. And actually acknowledging even the people who seem the most orthodox may well actually have an incredible diversity around them. And actually, I think it's around providing difference and a range of voices as much as possible.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. One of the challenges of running a 30-minute session is that we often feel like we're scraping the top layer of the tip of the iceberg. But I feel like we've had a really wonderful start of a conversation, and I hope that you can all take this conversation and continue those conversations within your workplaces. So thank you once again for your time, Kirsten and Kathryn. Also, thank you to Jackie and Carolina, who have been with you working behind the scenes to help make this session happen. This session has been recorded, so we'll email you a link once it's available to view online. If you know somebody who'd be interested in watching it, please feel free to share the link once it's live. Otherwise, we'll return for another Insight in Conversation session in September to coincide with the release of the next issue of Insight. Speaking of which, we're currently taking submissions for the July-August issue of Insight. We have guest editors on board from ALIA's New Generation Advisory Committee, and the theme is Imagining the Future. So if you're keen to write something, our submission deadline is next week. But until then, thank you so much for coming along, and do enjoy the rest of your day.